Well, thank you so much for attending Lunch with the Masters, Hypnosis and the Psychotherapy Relationship. I want to welcome all of our participants at the 60th annual meeting of the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis, and also to welcome all of our future webinar viewers because we are recording this panel. So thanks for joining us. As an introduction, my name is Eric Spiegel. I'm the president-elect of the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis, and I'm a psychologist. And I have the distinct honor and privilege today by being joined by 4 esteemed psychologists and experts in this treatment area. And I'm just going to go ahead and really briefly and inadequately introduce them from right to left, and then we'll get started. All the way to the right is Carolyn Gage. She's a psychologist, and she is author of multiple books. And the books include The Affect Regulation Toolbox, Anxious in Love, The Road to Calm Workbook, and she's an expert in anxiety disorders and couples therapy. Sitting immediately to my right is Michael Diamond. He's a psychologist and psychoanalyst in Los Angeles, California. Some of you may recognize him. He's the author of several seminal papers on the symbiotic alliance in hypnosis in the 1980s. He's also the author of My Father Before Me, How Fathers and Sons Influence Each Other Through Their Lives. To my immediate left is a mentor and friend. All of you are friends. This is Dr. Elgin Baker, a psychoanalyst and psychologist whose reputation, like everyone else on this podium, precedes him. He's been the author of many seminal papers on hypnosis, hypnoanalysis, psychotherapy, relationship, and psychoanalysis, including papers, groundbreaking papers in the early 80s on the treatment of psychotic patients using concepts of object relatedness and hypnosis, and a paper in 2000 on the hypnotic relationship and attunement. And all the way to the left, you all should be familiar with her by now because she gave the plenary address on Thursday in the pre-conference, Dr. Maggie Phillips. Maggie is a psychologist and an expert in the treatment of trauma and pain. She's the author of many books, including Healing the Divided Self, that she co-authored with Claire Frederick, and recently Freedom from Pain with Peter Levine. It's a distinct honor and privilege to have the 4 of you joining me today. And as we've discussed, this is intended to be an informal panel on the relationship, an exchange of ideas. And with that, let's get started. So my first question to all of you is one that at first might seem a bit basic, and that is as follows. Research has found that relationship factors in psychotherapy are the most predictive of outcome. And so my question to you is, how might you define what those relationship factors are? And how do you imagine that they are encompassed in hypnosis?
Okay, I'll begin. Well, first of all, the jury's in about that the relationship is more important than any particular approach. You can't hear me? That the relationship is the most important variable, regardless of what approach you use. But I think it's really synchronistic to create that relationship by using hypnosis. Because as you and Elgin very eloquently spoke to yesterday, attunement is so important in the healing relationship. And what do we do in good hypnosis? First of all, we create a safe container. Secondly, we observe. We pay attention, we look. And then also in hypnosis, we kind of establish this. We establish, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you have to talk right
Point
into
it down. It's supposed to be like licking an ice cream cone, I have to remember. Also in hypnosis, we establish our belief that there are healing resources within the person, not just from us. So that as well enhances the connection. and optimism that is so important in good psychotherapy.
I think I would echo some of those same themes. For me, to be most sort of succinct about it, I think in psychotherapy and in hypnosis that the relationship is both the container and the conduit of those processes that promote change. And for me, hypnosis is ultimately and primarily a relational experience because of many of the things that Carolyn mentioned, but particularly because of its capacity for attunement, not only in a phenomenological sense or a psychological sense, but very much in a somatosensory capacity as well. And that sense of being with the other in a particular way that can address the various developmental failures in relationships, that can provide a safe place for engaging difficult affects, that can create a paradigm for new ways of being in a relationship that feel secure and gratifying, make it for me the essence of any kind of hypnotherapeutic intervention.
Can I go next? Yes. What I would say, and I agree with both of my esteemed colleagues, is it better this way?
Oh, you know.
I have a, yeah, double mic, we could try that. Anyway, I agree with both of my esteemed colleagues, and I would say for me, the interactive space between the therapist and the client is fundamental to my understanding of the hypnotic relationship, and both people create that space. The nature of hypnosis and how we use it arises from that space, and we, I believe, end up creating mutual rituals, boundaries of what a safe space is, and the suggestions and language that can help us to shift the client's experience in the direction of the goals that they want to attain. So that's what I would say.
Okay, I'm not sure I can add a whole lot except it's making me think of a wonderful pithy adage that I heard many, many years ago. I think it was by Jules Mosserman, an old-time psychiatrist who was looking at the work of Milton Erickson in the 40s. And he says it's a wise hypnotist that knows who's hypnotizing whom.
That's great.
So,
That's great.
So to speak about the whole phenomena of relationship and hypnosis, I can't imagine that there's any such thing as hypnosis without relationship, and that includes
Right.
self-hypnosis,
Yeah.
because who is giving suggestions to whom? As long as there's a suggestion, there's an other. Whether that suggestion's coming from inside one's own head, a part of oneself, an ego state, if you like, or whether it's an outside hypnotist. And as we all know who do any hypnosis, anybody who's hypnotizing someone is also experiencing along with them some elements of trance, what I like to call a contact trance. So I'm sure we'll have a lot more to say about all of this, but relationship is the same as hypnosis.
And there are certainly many more questions that I'm prepared to ask you, but I'm just wondering if there are any associations that come up in hearing one another's responses.
Well, I guess one thing I would say is I know, Carolyn, you made the point that the jury is out about the significance of the alliance, and I disagree with you about that. In fact, the American Psychological Association has a major publication called the American Psychologist, and in middle of the last summer, they had an entire issue that consisted of meta-analyses of the data, which essentially concluded what many people had concluded before, that analysis and treatment outcome are inexplicably connected, although there remains some concern about whether that connection is that positive outcome is due to alliance or positive outcome produces alliance. So the connection between the two, I think, is very clear. There's also the Division 29 journal Psychotherapy, which published an issue in January of this year, looking at all the data on Therapeutic Alliance, and it went a particular direction in the same way of making that conclusion. But I also wanted to respond, Michael, to what you said, which is, I think it is true that even in self-hypnosis, we're engaged in a relationship, and that relationship could be the internalized representation of the person who taught you hypnosis, a therapist you may have worked with, but it might at times also be a significant internal representation of other important people in your lives. And I know from my own experience with self-hypnosis, who is giving me suggestions in terms of my sensibility varies. And sometimes it's my analyst, and sometimes it's the person who taught me hypnosis in graduate school, and sometimes it's my beloved Erica Fromm who comes back to suggest that I finish my book. And at other times, you know, it's other internal representations. But it always occurs within the context of an internalized relationship, and I think that's a really important point.
It is.
I'd like to say something about that too, because we're all here as medical people or psychotherapists and so on. And I think we have to consider that internal representation or that internal suggester, not only for health and positive outcome, but also for negative outcome. And psychopathology is so much connected to, you might say, internalized negative self-hypnotic states that people are in. And those of us who were trained in hypnosis and they've gone on to psychoanalysis, for example, have a particular kind of advantage over many psychoanalysts who haven't been trained in hypnosis, and that is because we understand the way in which negative suggestion operates in the psyche of our patients. So, as Elgin says, you know, it can be a very positive representation of our hypnotist or someone who is a very good object for us, but it also can be a very negative representation of someone that we've incorporated, a traumatic or abusive parent, for example, and so on.
Right, and added to that, I would add to that you know, sometimes the negativity can come from a part of the self, whether you're doing self-hypnosis or you're working with someone else. You can elicit these parts of the self without intending to sometimes, but sometimes in a very intentional way. And that can really either take the relationship in a positive direction or a very negative direction at times. But if you know this, then you can be equipped to expect that that may happen and then be able to utilize that. I like the Ericksonian word utilization. It's really a central strategy for me in working hypnotically with people, is to use what is theirs and what is there between us.
I wanted to react to some of the comments that have been made. One of the things that I heard is that there's this parallel process of the unfolding relationship, how that's experienced in the room, how that's experienced hypnotically, and the relationship that our patients internally have with themselves. And I'm so struck, as I'm sure all of you are, that many of the patients whom we initially see, or this could certainly be in some sort of problematic enactment in the treatment, are in a negative trance state, because as we understand about dissociative processes, this happens naturalistically all the time. And there's sort of two aspects that I really identify with that. One is this somatization, right? So people will present with pain issues, with other sort of somatic manifestations that I believe are a function of that internalization of the negative relationship with themselves. And the second is that there's this foreclosure of mentalization, this foreclosure of curiosity about the mind. So it's as if the doorway to exploring one's relationship with the mind, with their own mind, has either never really been opened or has been shut down for a long time. And so my question to all of you is, as the relationship unfolds, how do you engage the curiosity of your patients to begin to naturalistically allow for this internalization of the positive therapeutic relationship to unfold internally? And how does this transpire through hypnotic suggestion?
That's a big question.
Who wants to start?
I'll
What
say
do you
something.
start with?
I could get us started.
Okay, good, Michael.
You know, curiosity is a natural instinct, the epistemological instinct. It's there from the very beginning of life. So if it's not developed, if something has inhibited it or gotten in the way of developing it, that's what we want to deal with in some way. However you work as a therapist, as an analyst, you know, we often work with whatever is inhibiting or causing the resistance to unleashing something that's so natural. How do you get someone to play, for example, in the therapy milieu? Well, a lot of times it's by helping someone to recreate or to regress to a state where they could do that. And hypnosis is a wonderful vehicle to be able to do that. There are other ones to use, of course, but we're talking about hypnosis, and that's a beautiful way to get a return to that childlike place where curiosity flourished.
Sorry. One thing I might add to that is the preparation that you need to do for yourself before the client walks in. To move into a place of curiosity yourself. People come into therapy with such shame and self-judgment. So I think it's really wise to take a few minutes yourself before you see your next person, to move into that space of letting go of judgment, letting go of fatigue, letting go of the feeling like next, which sometimes we can get into, and moving into openness to the experience of the other, and that can be modeled and definitely reinforced with hypnotic language.
I would agree with that, and I would add that one of the things I do sometimes when I am aware of negative countertransference, which is less than it used to be, I might say. But when it comes, you know, it sort of shines a dark cloud over, that's a mixed metaphor, over the patient and you. And what I do is think back to all my work with this client and find a positive image that represents our best work together. And if I review that, it doesn't take more than a few seconds. I'm ready to meet them with this curiosity you're talking about.
Yeah. Good.
What will happen this time? Yeah.
You know, I think it is true to say that the relationship in hypnosis, as in psychotherapy more generally, is in fact evolving. And as I think everyone in this room has seen, the kind of phenomenology associated with that evolution shifts from time to time. And sometimes there is a sense of togetherness and closeness, and sometimes there is a sense of disengagement. Sometimes there is a sense of more or less regression, and so on and so forth. And it is, in my mind, I think, the experience of those shifts, which is an inherent invitation to being curious about them. And we certainly take advantage of that in doing hypnotic work as we try to facilitate attentional shifts from body to mind, or from hands to feet, or from breathing to the weight of our body on a chair. And also in terms of our use of language, with changes in pace and in the meaning of words that may be duplicitous. And what we do in that way is we're breaking cognitive set. But I think that all of those shifts, along with the regression inherent in this work, invites the experience of things that bring naturally some curiosity about what they mean or how they occur or what they are about. And I think that facilitates not only the relational implicit suggestion for curiosity, but the vehicle by which the experiencing of them can be the vehicle for developing the capacity to respond to suggestions.
The association that came to my mind when you were saying that, ironically, was on the lights that are shining on this podium, and how, you know, a light can be experienced in so many ways. Because I think what I heard you speaking to was the manner in which, you know, you invite curiosity through the hypnotic process by directing attention. And as we understand, hypnosis is indeed focused attention and absorption. And yet that subjective experience of a light can feel so many different ways, right? It can feel warm, it can feel illuminating, it can feel harsh, it can feel intrusive. And so, you know, as you're sitting with your patients and utilizing hypnosis in this way and paying attention to their experiences, and I know this is a general question, perhaps you want to respond with an anecdote. I'm wondering sort of how you kind of subjectively, experientially adjust to that process as they respond in various gradations of positivity or negativity.
You ask good questions, Eric.
Well, I'll just say very briefly that I think it's inevitable that the process of attunement, which I think is heightened by hypnotic trance, and the sort of contact trance, as Michael called it, that we all go into in varying ways when we're doing the work, makes it a kind of inevitability that we shift as they shift. Not only in terms of what we're thinking and feeling, but how our bodies are reacting. And so I think that it's part of the attunement which is at the heart of hypnosis and takes us into that kind of transitional space, that interactive place where we are together in a way which allows for increased flexibility and permeability of boundaries.
I would add that I have been hugely influenced by Milton Erickson. And so what I learned from him and his work and his students who taught me is that we have such flexibility in languaging, in how we regard a client. For example, he would, on purpose, make himself one down from the client. That was one of his signature ways of getting the client who might be ambivalent to rise into a more equal relationship. So I'm aware of that, and I think it's balancing authenticity, which is very important. Like I don't want to just be Milton Erickson or somebody else using their techniques. And with the knowledge that I have of how people are, how people can resist change right before it happens. And that's one of the truisms that sometimes I will say when somebody is pushing against what's coming from me. I'll say that, you know, it's understandable that you would question me because you have had so many experiences that are counter to what I'm talking about. And I also know that those moments often precede the beginning of a shift, because you're noticing, you're attending to the process that I'm suggesting to you, maybe even wanting to believe it, and also pushing against it. And that can lead further. That can lead us both further.
Well, I'd like to share an anecdote.
Okay, go.
Moving away a little bit. I'd like to share an anecdote. I had the opportunity about 5 years ago to have a client who had seen me 30 years previously come back to therapy.
Wow.
Now, and this will say something about the relationship. When I first started seeing this woman, I felt like I really didn't know what I was doing. I had taken my first beginner hypnosis class, not even from ASCH. I felt like I really felt like anybody in my city would do a better job with my clients. I was so insecure. But I proceeded. And the therapy terminated about 2 years later when I left town. 35 years later, she comes back. At this point, she's in her late 50s. She's a therapist herself. And I said to her, "What do you remember about that therapy with me?" And she said, "You were the first person who made me feel cared about. You were the first person who believed my story. You were incredibly persistent, and you saved my life." And I said, "How did I save your life?" She said, "Well, you realized I was an alcoholic, and you said you wouldn't see me again until I went to AA, and I never drank again." Now, I really didn't know what I was doing in a lot of ways, but those fundamentals of relationship, I kind of got it in my 20s, and it affected some good change.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, I think, something that's also very important, and that is, how do we deal with our patients who are terrified of having a relationship? And there are certainly many patients, who have been so burned and traumatized by relationships that, of course, you as the therapist, I as the therapist, am in a position of having to tolerate what analysts call the negative transference right from the beginning. And that really taxes us in particular ways. I like what Maggie's point was about being able to accept that way of non-relating, relating. It becomes very, very important to convey to the patient that you can survive or tolerate what the patient needs to experience you as for often a considerable period of time, depending on the kind of psychopathology that you're dealing with. So I want to just open up the whole idea of relationship. It's not simply about let's call it attunement, which is, of course, a crucial dimension of relationship. It's also about being able to tolerate the solitude of the patient within a relational container in some way. I think it was Rilke, the German poet, who said, "A good marriage is a marriage where each is able to be the guardian of the other's solitude." That's certainly what a good therapist also, I think, has to be able to do in the relational domain. And hypnosis is geared for that.
I'm curious, Michael, from your analytic perspective, what is happening within you as that is occurring in the encounter?
That's a great question. One of the things that I think is so important, I'll certainly be stressing this in my own little workshops and so on, is that we build something inside ourselves, in our own internal world, that allows us to contain a plethora of feelings, sensations, reveries, dreams, wild fantasies, associations, and that we're able to tap into that at times in our work with a patient. So when a patient comes in and, for example, is very challenging right off the bat, or very hostile, or screaming at us, or whatever it may be, we have a place inside that we can go. A place that I think, by the way, is often really facilitated by our own self-hypnotic work over the years, and our own individual therapies, certainly. And that we can have a container where we can experience being very bad in someone else's eyes, and not having to freak out about being the bad object, but can be able to hold that sense of they need to experience right now us as very bad, and while it makes me angry or scared or whatever, I can contain that. That's important.
Thank you.
I want to take us maybe in a slightly different direction, but not really, which is to also point out the element of co-regulation that takes place. And the more we create this safe flexible container, the more likely that is to happen. So that what happens in a sense is that we're both of us are influencing each other, making suggestions to each other, whether non-verbally or verbally, symbolically or in other ways. And we can, as we keep that going, safety expands and deepens. And my experience is it expands to the point where we're then in this ventral vagal flow, which is what Porges calls, I think it's the same thing as the interactional space. And it's extremely powerful. What happens is that space, or that third entity, I would call it, which is a combination of both of us, is then potentiated by both people. Both people add to it. Both people at this point are taking it in, absorbing it. And I'll just give you a quick example. I did a demonstration at a conference with a patient that was really quite challenging. I thought at the time, and I did find out, that she had a severe dissociative disorder, though she wasn't DID. And I don't even remember how I got through the demonstration, but I was very aware of staying connected to her and just really following her lead most of the time. Occasionally I come out and do a pacing and leading, as some of you know that terminology. And at the end, we're sitting there together, and we're in silence, but there's this connected feeling that it just felt really good to me. And I got this image, which I decided to share with her. I asked her permission to do so. And the two of us were sitting on a porch in rocking chairs, side by side, rocking together in the same rhythm. And she said, "Oh, that's perfect. That's exactly how I'm feeling right now. I don't know how we got here, but I'm really enjoying it." So to me, that's an example of that kind of co-regulation process that keeps expanding and growing.
That's why I used the title on one of my papers, "It Takes Two to Tango."
That's right, Michael.
Right.
And I guess I just want to offer a bit of a summary and then sort of put it back to all of you. I've heard a couple of things really repeated in a lot of your descriptions. One thing that really sort of stands out is this existence of a transitional space in the multitudes of ways that it unfolds. It can unfold in the hypnotic imagery and suggestion. It can unfold inside and outside. It can unfold within oneself and between and within our clients. And another thing that really has sort of stood out relatedly is this relationship between self-regulation that you were speaking about, Michael, and co-regulation that you were speaking about, Maggie. And I was struck in your descriptions about how we're constantly moving between the co-regulation and the self-regulation. And sometimes, that process of self-regulation might take multiple sessions. It might take years for something to really kind of filter and process and become apparent about what we're experiencing in a way that can help us understand and work with and regulate our clients. Sometimes it might happen in a millisecond. It might just be a felt, embodied sense that emerges in the space. What are your ideas about how this aspect of being together and being within oneself contributes to therapeutic action? And that term can be used in different ways. It can be used in a more kind of task-oriented way thinking about certain aspects in your book, Carolyn, with affect regulation tools. It can happen more in a sort of experiential aspect of attunement that's transformative. I think this is something that you've written about, Elgin. I'm wondering if you can sort of speak between this interplay of self-regulation and co-regulation that happens in this transitional space and how that creates action.
Another good question.
Well, I'll take a stab. I think that this use of transitional space, which some of you may not be familiar with that term, is really rooted in a developmental experience of being able to feel both attachment and separateness without being overwhelmed by the anxiety of it. And makes reference to those transitional objects described by Winnicott, like security blankets and teddy bears, that are used for self-soothing and for the containment of affect related to the process of separating, and helps, therefore, to develop a tolerance for the boundaries between self and other. And I do really think that part of what these shifts do, which contribute to therapeutic action and therapeutic outcome, is it allows us to learn about the capacity to acknowledge and to flex our boundaries and to deal with the affects associated with them. And for people who have been abused and intruded upon, who have felt engulfed, who have been unable to separate because of the relationships of their past, the capacity to experience both being bounded and separate, but also and often simultaneously attached, using Winnicott's term of alone in the presence of the other. It's a very powerful corrective emotional experience. And it is that in-between space where the phenomenology of connection and disconnection, of attunement and disattunement, of co-regulation, I think, occurs. And I'll just mention in closing a Shakespeare quote that came to me yesterday morning when I woke up and I was having a dream, and I shared it in the workshop that Eric and I did together. The quote is from the prologue to The Merchant of Venice. And Shakespeare, of course, was a great observer of human nature. And it goes, "So tell me, where is togetherness bred? 'Tis in the heart or in the head? How nourish it? Seen and not seen. We find it in the in-between."
Great.
Which seems to be in that in-between. It could be viewed as a sacred space, really.
Yes.
Kind of.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
I just wanted to add two little things that may or may not be, maybe tangential, but as long as we're into quotes, I have a favorite quote from the Dalai Lama.
Ah.
And the Dalai, and this relates to the fact that we're here to become more skilled, to become more wise. But the Dalai Lama said, "Wisdom and compassion are considered two wings of the bird of awakening, inseparable, each an aspect of each other, each needing the other to be its true itself." And we could substitute the word skills and compassion. And then one other thing, if I can just say one other thing, piggybacking with you, Maggie, is one of the things that we're experiencing now, particularly with our young people. I'm seeing so many people, young people with anxiety right now, more than ever. And Stephen Porges actually had an explanation for that. And he said it was because we, but particularly our young people are not looking at each other.
Right.
And that he had a whole cascade of phenomena that result in deleterious effects of not looking. If we're down looking at our phone or our iPad, we're not receiving those mirroring neurons. We're not seeing the head nodding that you're giving me right now that makes me feel good. We're not getting it. So as a result, we're getting a whole host of somatic sequelae and anxiety and despair. So it becomes all the more important, the work that we're doing, that we look and give attention.
Yep.
I wanted to respond to that because I think it's a really interesting topic. I'm sure everyone in this room has a perspective on that.
Yeah.
One thing that's really interesting about this, the younger generation's relationships with devices is that on the one hand, I think that they deprive these sort of basics of relational experiencing. But on the other hand, I might suggest that they create unrealistic expectations about the responsiveness of another, because I say this from my own relationship with my phone. It's there for me whenever I need it. I can go to it whenever I want it. It will tell me whatever I want to know. And it's very hard to put down. I want to hold it. And so in this respect, it's a transitional object that sadly becomes more of a, at least I think, inaccurately perceived realistic object. And I think about the Joaquin Phoenix movie, Her. So kind of given that, imagine that, you have patients, clients presenting to you with these kinds of dynamics. How to be with that? How to work with that? What comes to mind?
Yeah, from a transitional object to an addictive object is really what we're talking
Right.
about. And
Which most addictive objects are.
yeah. Right. And of course, a therapist can become that, too.
That's right.
So I guess what I thought of responding to kind of where we are now, and there's so many ideas and really interesting thoughts going on in this room, I think, at this point, that there's something very important about the capacity to hold the tension in that transitional space that we're in, and particularly as therapists, we're really asked to hold the space inside and in the relationship with the patient where there can be an experience of non-satisfaction, an experience of not completion, an experience of lack or gaps that's part of development, that's part of maturation. And I think hypnosis is a wonderful vehicle, again, for being able to experience gaps, frustrations, dissatisfactions in a way that's not overwhelming, in a way that, Franklin Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. How do we regulate being able to experience the tension of being in relationship, which is an inherently tense kind of experience between separateness and togetherness? We're always negotiating that. That's why marriages go through ups and downs, and some fail all the time. How do we do that? So hypnosis can become a vehicle, as psychotherapy is, of course, for being able to develop that muscle or that capacity inside to tolerate the tension, the differentiation, in Freudian language, the inherent conflict that the psyche has to be able to endure. So.
You want to go?
I feel a little speechless right now.
Feel a little speechless. Okay, I'll go. I was thinking while you were talking, Michael, about a client I have who is one of the most negative people I have ever met. And of course, she comes by it, naturally, and just in the space of her childhood, where both parents were terrible in terms of attachment. There was little to none by one, who was absent most of the time, and the other one was intrusive and very attacking, criticizing all the time. So after the first session, and the person who referred her to me said, by the way, I would like to send you somebody who's really challenging. I said, well, how are they challenging? And she said, well, she's really negative. I could not find a way in to help her. I said, well, I don't know if I can help, but I'm certainly willing to have a consultation to see how it feels. And I was tempted after the first session to say, well, I don't think it's a good fit, but I didn't. I said, let's try this for a few sessions and see how we both feel. And what came to me, she had terrible pain, and I knew that was part of her negativity. She just was hurting all the time. So I used one of our classic hypnotic techniques, which is the brain's control room. Does anybody remember who created that? I couldn't remember his name. Corey would know if he's in here. But anyway, it's where you have a miniature self that travels to the brain's control room and begins to make adjustments so that it's in the direction of what the client wants. And so I started off very, sort of bare bones, not giving much information, except to say that the miniature self, if she could imagine, would be a very small part of her, microscopic really, who was exactly the same as her, and yet had the ability to move through the body, which of course she, as an adult person, could do very differently. This part of her had a more direct connection with the body. So she seemed to accept that, and as Carolyn says, I'm always observing after every suggestion to see, is the person taking this in? Is this a yes response? Is it neutral? Is it, oh my God, let me out of here? What is it? And we just kind of went through that process, and at the end, and first of all, I really thought, I'm not sure she can be hypnotized. She was verbalizing that. I'm not sure I can be hypnotized. I said, well, the great thing about hypnosis is that everybody has their own way of being hypnotized. So we have to find out what your way is. And I don't know if we'll do that today or later, but she was willing to try. So at the end she said, I was really surprised. I think I was hypnotized. I said, really? That's amazing. And she told me all these things that happened that I had not suggested at all. But there are things like she took one suggestion and turned it into golden healing light that was streaming through the body at these places where the pain was the worst. And other suggestions like that, or images like that. And we have really evolved into a very good relationship. We are now in that co-regulation stage where she will receive from me, I will receive from her without feeling like I've got to, protect myself. And we're just expanding all the time. And I really feel like that is such the essence of the kind of hypnotherapy I want to do with people.
So I'm struck that thus far we've spoken about various aspects of being together. We've spoken about some vignettes that really inform our theoretical conceptualization of how that relational process unfolds in hypnosis and in the therapeutic process. We've spoken about the co-regulatory process. We've spoken about the transitional space in which internal fantasy and experience meets external reality, and how hypnosis can work in the service of this. I'm aware of the time. I guess the question that comes to mind, I think it's somewhat been referenced, but I think it's still okay to ask it. There's a quote from D.W. Winnicott in his 1970 book, Plain Reality, that says, "From being comes doing, but there can be no do before be." And I'm wondering, how does the experiential being of hypnotic relatedness influence the being of your client's internal states in trance? And how do these dual aspects of being, relational and internal, influence therapeutic action or the doing of what is done in therapy?
And we each have 1 minute to answer.
Yeah, really, 30 seconds.
We'll stretch it a little bit. We'll cheat.
Who wants to start that one?
You.
Me? Well, I think it just is a kind of summary of everything we've been talking about, and Eric alluded to that. How does it happen that there is this remarkable co-regulation and synchronization at the level of the body and of the mind? I'm not sure that we know exactly the mechanism of how it happens, although I think it's probably rooted in the natural attunement between mother and infant, and in all of our experiences of intimacy, which give us practice in being able to do that as we try to be authentically present with the other, both purposefully and automatically. What does it contribute to therapeutic action? As I said in the beginning, I think it contributes everything. That what we do does, in fact, come from how we are together. And that sense of being is at the heart of attunement. And attunement is, as I said at the beginning, both the container and the vehicle by which we are able to achieve various kinds of therapeutic action.
I would certainly agree with that attunement is central. It's essential in co-regulation. It's also essential in self-regulation. My friend Bonnie Badenoch, who some of you may have known, she's an interpersonal neurobiology person. And she said, we were going to do a webinar on, I think it had to do with self-regulation. And she said, Maggie, I need to be clear with you. There is no such thing as self-regulation. And I thought, oh, this is going to be interesting. And she said, the reason I say that is because self-regulation has to flow from co-regulation. If the person has not had the experience of being regulated by another, they can't possibly do that for themselves. They just can't do it. I said, wow, this is great. We're going to talk about this as the center of the webinar. And I do believe that both are necessary. And I think that Stephen Porges, when he talks about engagement, which is also so important, how do you engage a client so that they want to engage with you? Also has to do with self-engagement. If the client is on Saturn with a huge anxiety disorder, they cannot engage with you in the same way that you're engaging with them. So I think it has to do with understanding these things, these concepts, and realizing that if we can be with the other. So it's the staying with that Porges really emphasizes, and those of us up here I think do too. If you stay with somebody, you can only be in a state of being. And out of that will come action, will come change, and so many other things. So
I will just add, Maggie, thank you, Michael, add not only you do have to learn about this, and I'm learning so much from all of you, I believe, at least for me, I have to have an intention of doing it.
Right.
And that intention, because if you see a lot of people, it can be kind of routinized. I'm being honest here.
Yep.
And so I try, again, before I see someone, to move into that intentional space. And then just piggybacking again with you, is that internal attunement must have been there for you to have that creative imagery of the rocking chair that was just the right fit for that person. And where does that come from?
Exactly.
I don't know, but it comes.
It does come.
When we're humming the same tune.
Right.
Yeah. The unbidden that comes.
Yes, there you go.
it feels like maybe my last comment will be to say, I hope you come to the plenary, because this is what I'm going to be talking about in a lot of ways, in much more depth. But I wanted to just kind of end by referring to the being and doing aspect, because I was thinking of the case you presented and that very creative, unbidden image that came to you. I think that what really is required is a kind of receptivity in our minds as therapists, hypnotherapists, psychoanalysts, that we can intend to open that space inside us. Winnicott, again, one of Elgin and my favorite analytic mentors, said that, you know, the most important thing for an analyst is not to be clever with his or her interpretations or ways of understanding, but to create a space, a play space, where the patient can creatively find their own solutions, essentially. And that's exactly what she demonstrated, I think, with that vignette. So I'll close for now with that.
And if I could make just one last comment, I would address it to our newest colleagues, some of whom I hope are here, who are learning hypnosis for the first time, that as you are mastering all these wonderful skills that will allow you to do hypnosis, please stay aware of how you feel, how you are, how you be, not only eventually with your patients, but with the subjects with whom you're practicing, because that will be the very important foundation that will allow you to practice all these doing skills with real efficacy.
Well, with that, thank you so much for participating. And thank you for being here. It was such a delight.